So we've looked at a monopoly market, what it means, what these monopolies do, what kind of power they have over market price, and then how they make decisions about how much they're going to produce. Now, you probably came into this chapter with some preconceived notion about a monopoly. And generally people, particularly Americans, have a negative feeling about monopoly. Why is that? There really are three sort of major problems with monopolies when it comes to market efficiency. One is that they produce an inefficient level of output and charge an inefficient price. So we saw that in the last video, that the monopoly will charge a higher price to produce a lower quantity than the competitive firm will. They produce an inefficient level of output and charge an inefficient price. And two, there's less choice for consumers when there's only one firm in a market. And three, and we'll discuss this a little more later and define what I mean by this, rent-seeking behavior tends to occur in markets where there's a monopoly. So first, let's look at that first one. They produce an inefficient level of output and charge an inefficient price. So in a competitive industry, here's our supply and demand model that we're used to. In a competitive industry, we know that if there's no interference in the market will always go to the market equilibrium, the place where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. And we have spent ample time in previous chapters discussing the fact that this is efficiency. This is the point where the market has maximum welfare. The sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus is maximized at that market equilibrium. This is an efficient market. In a competitive market, the market does what it does, and we always end up with this competitive price, which is the equilibrium efficient price. Now, what is the difference in a monopoly? Here's the picture for a monopoly market, right? Remember we talked about in the last chapter the fact that marginal cost is the same thing as supply for a firm. So in this picture, if marginal cost is the same thing as supply, the competitive equilibrium and the efficient market outcome would occur at the point where marginal cost crosses the demand curve, where supply equals demand, right? So here, that's the competitive price, the market equilibrium if we were in a perfectly competitive, perfectly efficient market. But that's not what happens in a monopoly. A monopolist sets their quantity instead of setting their quantity where supply equals demand, where marginal cost equals demand. They set their quantity where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So way back here. And instead of setting their price where marginal cost equals demand, they set their price at the height of the demand curve where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Here. So a monopolist is not concerned with maximizing efficiency. A monopolist is concerned with maximizing profit. And when they maximize profit by choosing level of output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, they locate at a quantity that is lower than the market competitive quantity, and they set a price that's higher than the competitive or efficient price. So in a monopoly market, we have these two sources of inefficiency. One is that marginal revenue equals marginal cost instead of price equals marginal cost, right? So our price is higher than the efficient price, and our quantity is lower than the efficient quantity. And so if we sort of simplify that picture, here's a picture of a monopoly. There's the competitive outcome, the efficient outcome for this market, and here's the monopoly outcome instead. What we have is deadweight loss due to monopoly profit maximizing choices. So the consumer surplus becomes smaller than it was before, and that consumer surplus, a lot of that consumer surplus gets transferred to the monopolist. Some of that consumer surplus becomes deadweight loss. So two things happen here. One, we have deadweight loss because we have a decreased quantity, and two, we have consumers losing some of their surplus to the monopolist because of the increased price. The monopolist now is making more, and the consumer is paying more. So a snapshot of that is here. A monopoly versus competition. In terms of output or quantity, the monopolist produces a lower quantity than the competitive firm or the competitive market. In terms of price, the price in a competitive market is always lower than the price in a monopoly market. And so with a monopolist, we see deadweight loss, when in perfect competition, we don't. And so there's inefficiency associated with a monopoly. The second problem with a monopoly is that there aren't as many choices for consumers, and this is sort of an obvious problem. When there's just one firm, that firm sort of calls some shots, and you don't get to go somewhere else if you don't like what they're doing. So, for example, cable companies and bundling. You want a couple of channels, and the cable company says, well, if you want those channels, you also must pay for all these other channels, and you don't have another option. You can't go somewhere else because this is your cable company, right? It sort of forces you to buy more and just to get what you want. So you don't have as many choices because you can't go to a competitor because there is no competition in a monopolist. And the last problem with monopoly is rent seeking. So rent seeking is sort of some fancy econ terminology that means this. So rent seeking happens when resources are used to secure monopoly rights through the political process. So someone like Georgia Power, who they provide electricity to almost everyone in the state of Georgia, right? There are some people who get their electricity from a rural electricity company, but Georgia Power is for a bulk of the state of Georgia is the monopoly that provides your power. And Georgia Power employs a whole bunch of lobbyists who you can find throughout the year at the Georgia State Capitol in Atlanta, lobbying legislators to try to maintain their monopoly rights in Georgia over electricity provision. Georgia Power is paying these firms, or paying these lobbyists, to try to make sure that Georgia Power keeps being able to be the monopoly and keeps being able to charge the prices that they charge to make the profits that they make, when they could be using that money instead to provide a better customer service experience for their customers. They could be using that money to research and develop new and more efficient ways of providing electricity, right? But instead, they're engaging in rent seeking. They're spending their resources to secure monopoly rights rather than to just do a better job, right? Sometimes this happens when there are competitors who want to be a monopolist. They'll go and they'll lobby to try to convince lawmakers that really the nature of this particular market is that it makes sense to have one person providing the service and that they need to be that one person, right? Bottom line is, when rent seeking occurs, we're using resources to maintain monopoly rather than to become a more competitive firm, rather than just to do a better job of what you're doing, right? So these are some of the problems with monopoly. So what do we do about it? There are three, maybe some more, but three that we'll touch on possible solutions to these problems. One is you can break up the monopoly. So if there's a giant company that has a monopoly over a particular market, and it makes sense instead for there to be competition, then you can break that monopoly up. You can legally, in the U.S. at least, under the Sherman antitrust law from 1890 all the way back then, legally the U.S. government can require a company to break into smaller companies so that there's no monopoly in a particular market. So, for example, from 1913 to 1982, AT&T had a monopoly on all telephone service in the U.S., and in 1982, that company was split into 8 smaller companies, leading to competition and lower prices in the telephone service market. Another thing you can do to try to fix the problems with monopolies is you can reduce trade barriers, making it more possible for new firms to enter the market. So barriers to trade reduce potential gains from trade, meaning, so for example, if there are tariffs, then maybe an international company wouldn't want to try to enter the market in the U.S. because it costs too much to get their product to the U.S. because of tariffs. If you reduce those tariffs, then you encourage that competition and reduce monopoly power, which is one thing that's really nice in the U.S. is that we're not allowed to have tariffs between states, and so they're more likely to be interstate competition in the U.S. Anyhow, reducing barriers creates more competition, promotes more efficient use of resources, and sort of breaks down those monopoly markets. The third thing you can do, and a lot of times this happens particularly in the case of natural monopolies. So we mentioned Georgia Power, and when we talked about what a natural monopoly is, it happens in a market where there are just naturally these large economies of scale. The bigger you get, the lower your average cost of providing a service is, and that's the case for a lot of utilities like electricity. And so it just doesn't make sense to have a bunch of companies trying to set up their own electric grids. One, we'd have power lines all over the place, and two, there'd be super high costs for all these people entering the market, when it just makes sense really to have one company set up this grid that works well and have them provide the service, because it's a market in which there exists a natural monopoly. And so in those situations, sometimes it's desirable to reduce monopoly power, reduce monopoly inefficiencies by regulating the market rather than splitting up or eliminating the monopoly. So in Georgia, for example, the agreement is Georgia Power, yes, you can be a monopolist in this market, but we're going to regulate you. You got to follow some rules. They're going to help make things more efficient and better for customers. So governments can use price regulation. They can say to the firm, for example, we want you to look more like a perfectly competitive market. We want you to look more like an efficient market, and so you're not allowed to set those high prices. We want to make sure you set your price equal to your marginal cost, rather than equal to the height of the demand curve when marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So remember, for a monopolist, when they are maximizing profit, the price is always higher than marginal revenue, which means the price would be higher than the marginal cost. And so the government may regulate and say, nah, we'd actually prefer that you set the price equal to marginal cost so that the market is more efficient. When they do that, though, what happens to the monopolist? So if this is the monopolist's picture, right, so this is where they are, remember that for a monopolist, you're already maximizing profit where marginal revenue equals marginal cost with that price set by the demand curve. If the government then, so for this particular market monopolist, that means they have this sort of small sliver of profit when there's no regulation. If the government comes in and regulates and says, actually, we need you to set your price equal to marginal cost, the government is going to then be forcing them to this point where price, remember price is given by the demand curve, where price is equal to marginal cost, and now what is their profit? Now their average total cost is higher than the price, which means they are losing money. They experience a loss with regulation. And so if the government regulates this monopolist and says you have to set your price equal to marginal cost instead of setting your marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, what they're saying to the monopolist is, you can't make money. We're not going to allow that. And in fact, not only can you not make money, but we're going to require you to set a price that's so low that you're going to lose money. And then what happens? Georgia Power leaves the business and none of us have electricity. That's not necessarily an awesome solution. So yeah, that might increase market efficiency, but it's going to discourage the monopolist from providing the service because they now have a loss. So at price equals marginal cost, the monopolist experiences a loss. So that may not be as feasible a regulation as it at first sounded. It sounded nice because it would make the market efficient. It'd make the monopoly act like a competitive market. But it didn't really work. It's going to drive the monopolist out of business. So what can we do? One, the government can do this. They can require the monopolist to set price equals marginal cost and then provide a subsidy to cover their losses, to say, all right, we know you're going to lose money when you do this, but it's important enough to us that we will make up for that. We'll just give you the money that you've lost. Another option is, rather than saying you have to set your price equal to marginal cost, we'll say you have to set your price equal to your average total cost. What does that do to profit? It brings it to zero, right? So your price is your average revenue, and your average total cost is your average cost. And when your revenue and costs equal each other, then your profit is zero, which is better than negative, right? So, and it actually puts you sort of in the same ballpark that a competitive firm would be in. Competitive firms have zero economic profits as well. So then what would the picture look like? Now, there's a lot of lines here, I know. But now if we say, okay, we don't want you to set your marginal cost equal to marginal revenue because that's where we see all this great inefficiency in the market. But we know you wouldn't survive if we made you go all the way over here where marginal cost equals price. So why don't we compromise and get a little more efficient than where you would be without us, but not quite as efficient as a perfectly competitive market. Let's go to the point where your profits are zero. So you're not maximizing profit anymore, but you're also not going to lose money under our regulations. So let's have you produce where your average total cost equals price. Remember, price comes from the demand curve, and that would be here. Right? Why not here? Because you can produce more and reduce your costs, right? So you would keep moving to this point. Not that one, not this place where they cross, but this place where they cross, because this is more efficient. So let's produce where your average total cost equals your price. Now your profit is equal to zero, which is not as good as you would have been without us regulating, but without us regulating, you were super inefficient and you were charging people really high prices. But it's not as bad as it could be because we're not forcing you to into the losses territory. So maybe that's a better solution, a little bit of a compromise. So government subsidies, we can have you set your price equal to marginal cost and then the government just cover your losses, or we can compromise and have you set your price equal to average total cost, or if none of this works, oftentimes, and this happens like with water provision, with highways, things like that, that it turns out it's just not profitable for a monopolist, for anyone in the private sector to do, and so the government just takes it on. So we end up with government enterprise instead of private monopoly providing a particular product or service. A little caveat, when the government gets involved, of course, things can go crazy. The government intervention can eliminate profit motives and the necessity to innovate or improve efficiency. So if the government says, sure, you can be a monopolist, but we'll regulate you, you spend all your money rent-seeking, trying to maintain that monopoly status, and instead of trying to improve your efficiency. Or maybe even worse, when the government actually takes on provision of the service, when we go all the way to government enterprise, the government doesn't have a profit motive. The government doesn't exist to make money. And so the government doesn't have the same kind of incentive to improve their services or improve their efficiency that a private company would. And in fact, it's true that government employees are rarely fired, regardless of their performance, because there's not this profit motive. The free market firms under marginal cost pricing have no incentive to lower costs, right? So even when the government, rather than providing the service, when the government instead regulates the market and says you have to set your price equal to marginal cost, the firm is not going to lower their costs. They have no reason to try to innovate and make costs lower because they're already losing money. It's often better than government intervention and changing incentives for a firm is just to let the market do what the market does. So often better to try to encourage competition rather than to try to figure out a way for a monopoly to become more efficient.